welcome to today's Hopkins at Home session. I am Sarah Hoover, Associate Dean for Innovation, Interdisciplinary Partnerships, and Community Initiatives at the Peabody Institute. I'm here to introduce today's topic, the performing arts in a post-COVID-19 world, and to introduce our speaker, Dean of the Peabody Institute, Fred Braunstein. Dean Braunstein arrived in June of 2014 with a background as a pianist, a chamber musician, and a music educator, and a successful career as executive director of several prominent US orchestras in St. Louis, in Omaha, and in Dallas. He came to Johns Hopkins to reconnect with his commitment to educating young musicians and to bring his industry knowledge to bear on rethinking training for young artists at Peabody. In his time as dean, he has built a strategic plan on 5 pillars: excellence, interdisciplinary experiences, innovation, community connectivity, and diversity, in order to align training at the conservatory and the preparatory with the needs and expectations of 21st century artistic careers. In response to the devastating effects on the arts caused by COVID-19, Dean Braunstein gathered industry leaders, artists, and funders for a day-long symposium on February 10th. He is here today to share reflections on what we are calling the next normal as we emerge from the pandemic. We will leave ample time for a lively conversation about the future of the performing arts. So please feel free to post your questions or comments as we go along. And now I want to welcome Dean Braunstein. Dean Braunstein, thank you for joining Hopkins at Home today.
Thank you, Sarah, and nice to be with everybody today. And I've been looking forward to this. We are, usually when I talk, and I talk about Peabody a lot, and we'll spend some time talking about Peabody today, certainly. But really, the purpose of this is as Sarah alluded to follow up on a symposium that we hosted, Peabody hosted, and convened national and actually indeed an international symposium on February 10th. And I want to share some of what we took away from that. But in order to do that, I think it's useful for us to provide some context and for us to think together about what are some of the things that have existed in our field. When I say our field, I'm talking not exclusively about, we're talking about the performing arts. Certainly in the case of the Peabody Institute, a large portion of that is classical music, although there's a jazz program and a dance program and increasingly different kinds of music's being explored. But I think the purpose of really the symposium that we convened was indeed to focus, if not exclusively, largely on classical music. And so in order to understand the impact of COVID, I think it's important, as I said, to understand some about the context trends that existed pre-COVID and are perhaps being accelerated by COVID as we look to the future. So I have some slides that I would like to share with you, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions because I'm eager to get to that, certainly. So the thing that really prompted for me this thought process about what the impact of COVID-19 was going to be on the performing arts was a study that was released by the Brookings Institution in August. And the study focused really on the early months of the pandemic and was very focused on, I would say, the short-term impact of COVID-19 on the performing arts, which indeed has been devastating. And there are some statistics here that you can see that speak to that. But in a way, that was obvious. The immediate impact is obvious, but what was, I think, maybe more interesting and certainly important long term, as important as this is what is the long term impact of this. But the immediate impact, as you can see here in these statistics, was massive job loss in the performing arts, as it has been in many industries. But of course, in an art form that depended on live performance and people coming together, you can understand certainly what the impact would be. So, across the performing arts area, 2.7 million jobs lost, huge sales, in our industry, 150 billion in sales. It's interesting to note that there is the arts and culture represent about 4.5% of GDP. So it's not an insignificant figure. Almost every region of the country has been impacted in terms of when you look at arts and culture. And so, and in the fine arts itself, when we say fine arts, we're talking about orchestras and opera companies and chamber music, we're looking at about 1.4 million jobs lost. So it is enormous impact short term and devastating, really, in many ways for artists and for artistic institutions. The recovery from this, and again, I'm interested in this issue short term, but also long term, certainly is going to require massive investment. And the Brookings Institution report makes that point. And by the way, there have been a number of studies that have been done since this was the first one out of the gate. Deloitte did a big study as well, and a number of others have been done. But it's clear that it's going to require, as in other industries, very significant investment. There have been calls for major government funding to help the arts recover. Certainly, we'd love to see that, but I am also practical enough to understand and to know that when we look at the history of government support of the arts in this country, it's not good. It's not strong. Most of the support for the arts comes from the private philanthropy and from earned revenues, ticket sales. So the reality is that while we would love to see something on a massive scale, I'm not sure we will, and I don't think we can plan for that. We have to think about this more broadly. So this is where I think, understanding a little bit about the context for COVID within trends that predated COVID. So what you're seeing here now is a survey, a study that was done by the National Endowment for the Arts for the first decade from 2002 to 2012. And essentially it shows that it looks at the percentage of adults that attended a classical music event in a 12-month period. And so you can see a significant drop just in the 10-year period from about 11.5% to just under 9%. That's a big drop in a short period of time. And this is important because we want to try to understand again what were we facing anyway, and how is this going to be exacerbated by COVID-19. This is a continuation of that story. It brings that line into 2017, which was the most recent NEA study that was done. And you could see here that in the case of classical music, the drop continues, although the drop is less sharp between 2012 and 2017. There's a little bit more of a leveling off. And I would say that of these other fine arts represented here as well. You're not seeing significant growth, but you're not seeing the big declines that you saw in that decade. But nonetheless, it's a decline. And as a share of the market, the decline, that's a different measurement, but as a share of the market, that decline would probably be even larger, actually. Now, I want to segue to the question of diversity in the field, because you'll see when we come to talking about audiences long term, this becomes a very significant and important issue. It probably won't surprise a lot of you to know that classical music is not a field that has been rich with diversity. It's one of the real challenges of our field. And that's one of the challenges, I'll talk a little bit more about this soon, that Peabody is very focused on. But this is a very stark sort of view of it in the orchestra world that I came from. And orchestras have been talking about trying to diversify for some 25 or 30 years, if not more. And you could see here that, as recently as just a few years ago, those numbers are still very low. And it has to do with the pipeline to a classical music career, and it has to do with the sense of uh, exclusivity, I think, that a lot of people view classical music with. It's certainly the works that these institutions have presented have been overwhelmingly the work of, white European composers. And so, and this is all slowly changing, but I say slow, I emphasis on the slowly part. So this gives you some context for now. It's also fair to say, I think, that in the opera world and in the chamber music world, even there is more diversity, not a lot, but more diversity. But where this has really manifested itself, the really almost exclusively white nature of the business has been in the orchestra world. So it's a very real issue. Then, if you look at where we all know the population is going in this country, we are today, and this is again, probably most folks are familiar with these statistics. I think the thing to focus on is on the columns on my far left and the far right. And you could see that we will go from being a roughly 2/3 white, 1/3 minority or non-white population within 3 to 4 decades to a 1/3 white and 2/3 non-white, or minority majority, as it's sometimes referred to, country. And so the really fascinating thing about that is when you think about it, when you look back at the exclusivity of classical music and the lack of diversity in classical music audiences, and then you fast forward and look at where the demographics are going, and then you couple that with the slide I showed you earlier about the decline in audiences generally anyway, and the challenge that the classical music field has with that, then you really start to understand that these things conflate together to really create some real challenges. And this is without COVID. So now when we come to talking about COVID and the questions that and again, this was really spawned for me by the Brookings study, was, what will the impact long-term be? And will audiences come back? And is COVID-19 an interrupter, or is it just going to be actually really an accelerator of trends that we've already seen? I tend to believe the latter. And then the question, of course, for a school like Peabody is how is this going to impact how we think about how we train our artists going forward? And because that's the business we're in. What are industry conditions going to be like? And what is that training? How does that training need to adjust and adapt for our students? Because they're going to inhabit careers that go over these next 4 to 5 decades. And how do we adjust and react without overreacting also? Because that's also always I think a challenge as well. So one of the things that we did at Peabody last fall was we convened what we call the Peabody Conservatory Post-COVID Think Tank. And the purpose of this was really to, in many ways, this wasn't the first time we had thought about these issues in terms of innovation with training musicians, diversity. We had been thinking about these issues for several years now in a very intentional and focused way. But what did occur to me was that with COVID-19 and with the impact of COVID-19, and again, COVID-19 is an accelerator, it made us ask the question at Peabody, how do we need to think about, do we need to be even more bold about how we think about innovation and training young artists? And I think in many ways, Peabody has been quite bold and I'll talk a little bit about the new curriculum we have in place for our students in a bit. But I think that, the question we were really asking ourselves, or are asking ourselves with the think tank, is how can we be even more bold? Should we be more bold than how we've thought about this, given what we've all experienced with COVID-19? Not just in terms of, areas around innovation and diversity, but also technology is obviously a huge one. And so these are all the things that we've been thinking about as part of the conversation that we've been having with the think tank. At the same time, we had been thinking about convening a national symposium, which actually ended up being an international symposium in truth. But and my thinking on this was simply that, you know, Johns Hopkins University is a thought leader. We've seen that obviously in a big way with COVID-19 and Bloomberg School of Public Health, and you know, Hopkins really being a leading voice in statistics around the virus and treatments for the virus and all of the things that go along with that. So, you know, it seemed to me that Peabody ought to also be a thought leader, as we like to think of ourselves as, in this, you know, in the post-COVID environment. So we convened this group, and we had wonderful panels of some of the leading chief executive officers of the major organizations from around the country, institutions, particularly the service institutions that, you know, that look after orchestras and opera companies and chamber music groups. We had a wonderful panel of funders to discuss what they saw for the future. And then we also had a very distinguished group of performing artists, including several Peabody faculty. We had more than 1,300 folks participate in this day-long symposium, which was really a significant number across our field. And I think what that really spoke to was the incredible need for people to be engaging in these conversations. And we certainly saw that when we, throughout the day. So the takeaways, you know, in trying to think about sort of what were the headlines, well, obviously many things were talked about and in truth, you know, you can only scratch the surface, but clearly there were some things that really came through loud and clear. And beginning certainly with the fact that the recovery, and when I talk about the recovery, really short term, medium term maybe, is going to be very uneven and challenging. And I think there are a lot of questions about the pace at which audiences come back. And given the tendency of some of those audiences anyway, what will the impact of COVID-19 be on that? And that we all know that major investment, whether it's private philanthropy or government support, is going to be needed to help arts institutions recover. And in fact, we also know that there are institutions that won't recover. They won't survive this. There'll be some consolidation, I think. Second point, you know, the need, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The need, you know, for us to really diversify our institutions is urgent and existential, actually, for the field. And again, coming back to what you saw earlier about the lack of diversity in the classical music field writ large, the changing demographics, where our audiences currently come from, and then couple all of that with the profound, I don't want to say shift because it's been growing, but acceleration of the conversations across our country around anti-racism. And I think that when you put all of that together, there is an urgency that is coming from the field, and that I think is felt in the field today around this need to really diversify and not to do it at the periphery, but to really, it really has to be a focus of the work that we do as a field. The third point, and this is not necessarily in order, it's simply, you know, capturing what the points were, is the need for more flexible and adaptable institutions across our field. A willingness to connect in a very substantive, meaningful, deep way with communities. Now, this is not new for our field, talking about community engagement, but I have to say that when you look at major cultural institutions and you talk about community engagement, it is still a peripheral sport, if you will. It's part of the institution, but it's not something that has been as focused on as that, you know, concert series that takes place in the big hall that institution may be involved with. And so I think an understanding that how people experience performance, where they experience performance, what that content of those programs looks like, the need to connect what we do as a field with a larger audience in a way that's really relevant to people's lives and needs at this moment, I think is something that really came through in a very significant way. And I have to say that as somebody who's spent my life around the classical music industry and our world, we have not been a very flexible field. We have not had flexible institutions. Orchestras, by definition, are not particularly flexible institutions, the way they're constructed, the way they operate. And I think that it is, and I just use orchestras not to pick on orchestras, but as an example. So I think this need for flexibility and adaptability becomes really important and central, as it does for artists. And that's the last and certainly not least point here, that we need to have artists that are actually flexible and adaptable, and are able to see the work that they do as not just being about the product they have an affinity for or would like to produce, but really they are putting out a product that connects with audiences that they want to attract. And so I think flexibility and adaptability is something that applies both to artists and to the artistic institutions. And that we need to focus on how we get to those audiences as much as we focus on the product that we as institutions or artists are producing to begin with. So those takeaways, those were really the headlines, I would say, that were felt across the day. And again, they're not new issues, I think, but they are issues that I think take on more urgency and in the wake of COVID and what will follow in terms of recovery. So the good news for Peabody, and this is where I will just take a few moments to talk about Peabody. The good news is that for Peabody, we have been focused on these issues actually for some time now. Peabody, in terms of innovation, there are two areas I'd like to just discuss: innovation and diversity. Peabody, in the area of innovation, has developed over the last several years a curriculum that we call the Breakthrough Curriculum, which is providing our students with the kinds of flexible and adaptable skills they need to surround their core training. You have a very focused kind of training for young musicians around learning instruments, composition, singing, whatever their field may be. And so the need to surround those skills with skills that will, allow our artists to be more entrepreneurial, to think about how to do audience development, to think about technology and all the things they need to think about in terms of being a 21st century artist are really things that we have focused on in the Breakthrough Curriculum. We have also what we call Launchpad, which is a new career services center that we have at Peabody, again, to help our students think about issues of what it means to be a 21st century musician beyond just playing, just beyond your performance skill, your artistic skill. Similarly, in the area of diversity, we have focused on diversity across all aspects of a musician's career from a very early age to coming up through conservatory and into the field. And this is really an important point. And the reason it is because in our field, unlike a lot of fields, you can't decide you're going to be a violinist when you're 16 years old. It's too late. You have to, if you're going to be a serious violinist, you're starting when you're 5 or 6 years old, 7 years old. And that means you have to have access at a very early age. So through programs like a new partnership, we have the Kennedy Center, which is being funded by the Mellon Foundation through our Tuned In program and our preparatory. We are identifying young artists of color at a very early age that we can provide access and training and exposure at a very high level, so that we can create a pipeline so that by the time somebody is interested in applying to a conservatory like Peabody, they've had access, they've had experiences, and they've had the opportunities that that one needs in order to get into the field. And so, when we think about, we've focused very significantly on building in our conservatory, on building our a minority student population. Today, Peabody this year is about 18% Black and brown students. And that may not sound like a lot, but actually compared to our peers in the field is very significant. And we want to continue to build that. Similarly, with faculty is about 14% underrepresented minority, which is about, I'm sorry to say, 3 times what the average is across music schools across the country. So again, very intentional focus on how we create diversity in our own community, and so that Peabody can be a thought leader, not just in how we're training musicians, but also in the diversity of the musicians that we're training, and that are coming into Peabody and then going out into the field. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Sarah, and we'll continue the conversation.
So thank you, Fred. We do have a couple of questions coming in, and I'd like to turn to those first. And I have some for you that I've saved too, so we'll see where we go. Let's pick up on the innovation through technology aspect first. We have a question from Becca, which is, are there ways that Peabody is supporting the integration of traditional/classical music performance methodologies with technology to provide opportunities for audience engagement?
Yeah, so that makes a great question, and I think that, so let me preface it by saying this. I think that what is really fascinating about technology and classical music is that over the last couple of decades, I would argue that classical music has been wary of technology because of this idea that somehow it's going to replace live performance, or it is somehow dumbing down the performance, or whatever you want to say about it, or you can't have the optimal experience, which is ironic because, and the reason it's ironic is because nearly 100 years ago, the advent of electric recording really paved the way for tremendous access and expansion of the market for classical music with the advent of recording, and ultimately then in the early part of the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, in movies and even on television, things we frankly don't see today, but in reality was very much part of the popular culture in the first half of the 20th century. So technology and classical music have actually been very closely linked, but somehow in the last couple of decades, I don't know. I mean, it seems, I think our field has been more wary of it. And I think one of the really interesting things about COVID has been to, I think, push, our field to embrace technology more. And I think in a number of ways, both in teaching and in performance. We've seen it ourselves at Peabody. Like most schools, we've been online until actually this semester. We're actually hybrid this semester, but second half of this last spring semester and all fall, we were online. Everything we were doing was online. And so for many of our faculty, it was the first time they had taught online. And for many of our students, if not most, it was the first time they had taken a piano lesson online or a cello lesson online. So I think, and what was really discovered that was interesting about this was that it's been really embraced. And I think, yeah, there are things that don't work quite as well. If you're a singer and sound and working with an accompanist is more of a challenge. However, for many disciplines, it worked beautifully. And in fact, we had faculty, and I'll share this with you, who said, I was able to do my teaching that I had never thought about before because of the way I was seeing the student, the way I was working with the student, And so I think, and I mean, it almost brings a kind of objectivity that you don't get when you're in the room with somebody. So I think, and in case of performance, the ability to push performances out, to make performances accessible for people to be able to experience a performance, at the, maybe they want to hear part of the performance and then they want to go back and hear some of it later. I often listen to things like that on you. I'll go and I'll listen to something and I'll come back to it later. And that's, I think the freedom to do that, the ability to do that, doesn't take away from live performance. I am not, I don't believe I believe live performance will continue to be with us, and it always has been with us, because it's hard to substitute for that experience. However, I say that with some reservation, because when we think about things like virtual reality, and we've got a whole program now, Music for New Media, that incorporates virtual reality into the work that our students are doing. And one can easily imagine that, very soon, in fact, you can do it now, somebody can go and through virtual reality and sit on a stage with an orchestra that's performing, watching the conductor, and go from one section to another section, or be up on the podium with the conductor and experience from that vantage point. That's where we're moving to, actually. So I think we have to see that as an opportunity. We have to see it as a way of enhancing what we do, not substituting for live performance, but building on live performance.
Fred, you're making me remember the experiments we did in the concert hall with tweet seats and with
Yeah, right.
digital program notes.
Yeah, right.
And to your point about being wary of technology, what an event it was for us to incorporate those innovations, which were very small,
Yep.
allowing people to engage electronically while they were also listening to the music in the space.
Right.
It was a little cage rattling, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we have a funny thing in the classical music field that is there's something, and I get this as a pianist and having played earlier in my career many concerts, and Sarah knows this. I mean, as well as a singer. I mean, there's a kind of wonderful sanctity that and space that happens in live performance when you're on a stage and an audience is focused and you're focused. There's a wonderful thing that happens there, and it's very much part of our history and classical music. But in reality, the truth is, if you go back to the really early days of classical music, when people would go to classical music performances, first of all, they mixed it all up. It wasn't all just a symphony. You'd have solo performers, you'd have ensembles, people would play a movement, somebody would get up and say something, audience members would mill around. I mean, it was a much more social experience, actually. And it's really, we became very, I would say, rigid, in the last 100 years in our field. And I don't think that helped our field, frankly. And so I think we need to let go of some of that rigidity, and technology gives us an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. I'm going to move to a question from Harvey, which gets at the issue of what is it going to be like to return to concert halls or theaters to see live art again. And Harvey asks, what are some ways that an industry like Broadway can prepare to re-engage audiences as we adapt to the new COVID normal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Harvey. And, I'm not sure I can answer it, but I will say a couple of things. I think that, look, I think there will be some people, quite a number of people, I would say, that will be chomping at the bit to get back to see a live performance. They can't wait to get there and to be there. I think there are other folks that are maybe regular concert goers that will be more wary. And part of it is also just habit. Part of this is a habit. People get in the habit of doing certain things. And then when you get out of the habit, you always run the risk of not doing it. It's like I go to the movies every Saturday night, or I go to this, I have season tickets because that way I know I'll go to, whatever sporting event. Similarly with performing arts. So I think that there is there's an issue with, whether or not audiences, particularly older audiences, will return or will return so quickly. There's also just the question of the rate of return, right? We don't yet know what things are going to look like over the next year. We're not sure we're going to be able to have yet, a 100-piece orchestra on a stage, or, singers, singing on a stage, in front of an audience, and at what point we're going to be able to do that, or having a chorus on the stage, or whatever it might be. So, I mean, we're going to get there, and we'll get there probably in the next, 18 months, full-fledged, but we don't know exactly when that's going to happen. So again, this ends up being a prolonged period of time. I think presenters, coming to your question about Broadway, and I'm no expert on Broadway, certainly, but I think Broadway is really, really a challenge in the sense that Broadway is such a close. I mean, Broadway theaters are small generally, and they're not. You go in, it's a very close environment, and I think even in concert halls, it's easier to sort of spread people in distance a little more than it is at Broadway, where it's very, it's kind of a little hothouse. So I think there's a real challenge there. I think presenters, producers, all the people that run the institution is going to have to be very creative and very smart about how they talk to audiences and bring audiences back, and how they incent audiences. I think it's going to be all of that is going to have to be very very carefully thought through.
Yeah. We've gotten a lot of help from our friends at the other divisions of Johns Hopkins with establishing safe return to play protocols. And
Right.
this research has been going on around the world to get artists back on stage. But there's a lot yet unknown, and that needs to be further clarified in order for that to happen safely.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd like to shift from getting folks back into the concert hall to what the arts might do post-COVID outside of the concert hall. So I'm actually going to insert a question that I wanted to share with our audience. Pianist Stephen Huff made a really strong statement in the artist panel for the Next Normal Symposium. He said, "The arts have saved us this year." And I think we've all seen examples of the ways in which the arts have come front and center in people's um, visions as examples of just trying to hold people up, to alleviate stress, to respond to all of the social issues and the illness that have been endemic in our world. So I would like for you, Fred, to talk a little bit about post-COVID. What is the imperative for artists to engage with communities in new ways, in meaningful ways? How I heard very clearly in the panels and in the comments from the participants that artists need to shift their focus to be of service, to seeing themselves as service providers, and to be relevant. What does that look like from your vantage point?
So it's a great question. And I think a really important question. And I think to some extent it requires, first of all, it's not a new question, right? For our field, we've been talking about community engagement, as I said before. When I got into the orchestra business in late 90s, the community engagement had become a really big thing in the field. But again, with very few exceptions, it tends to be peripheral to the core activity of what the institution is doing. And I think that again goes to the core of the way musicians see. Musicians have a funny way of, and I'm generalizing obviously, but of seeing performance as, again, the sanctity of the performance space, the uninterrupted aspect of it. I'm sharing this wonderful thing with you, and we need to experience almost in a church or synagogue like environment, right? It's that kind of spiritual thing. And I think we as artists need to think about, the artistic experience in a much broader way. I was very struck by, in the pandemic, there was one, and there were a lot of things that got shown, on the internet in terms of artistic experiences. But one of the things that really struck me was very early in the pandemic, it was April, when it was really bad in Italy. There was a wonderful, thing that had circulated on the internet of this violinist, young violinist, and she was on a rooftop in Italy, and I don't remember the city, but it was, and she was just doing this impromptu concert. And people were like coming out and hanging out of their windows. They weren't going out at that point. Nobody was out in the streets. They were all, but they'd hang out of their windows and their balconies. And it was a very, very touching kind of thing. And I think the way, and I make the point because that performance as a performance was not probably, I can tell you, was much more impactful than probably 95% of the concerts that take place in standard concert halls that people go to when they go and they buy their ticket and they sit there, in terms of what the impact of that actually was. And I think it's really instructive in that sense, because I think what it teaches us is that what we as artists define as important performances or legitimate performances is again, I hate to use the term rigid, but is only one aspect of performance. It's one aspect of the experience. So I think this question of how we connect with audiences, the locality of those audiences, the ability for people to be able to interact with artists in their community, to know artists, right? And I mean, artists are their neighbors too, but to experience and to be able to have that art experienced in different ways that are meaningful to those people. That to me is, whether that's impromptu concerts or whether it's concerts in unusual spaces or whether it's living room concerts. I mean, it's, or outdoor. I mean, there are all sorts of, I think ways these things manifest themselves. But I think, but what it requires us to do, I think, is to think again much more flexibly and creatively about programming and what is programming, what is the right kind of programming for different kinds of audiences, and to be willing to let go of some of our own expectations about what it means to perform and what is the optimal performance experience. And I think that is we have to reorient our own thinking around that in order to really fall in love with what it means to do something like what that violinist did on that rooftop.
Thank you. Our one member of the audience, Susan, commends Peabody for having done so much to bring music to the city of Baltimore, such as through pop-up concerts. But she asks, are there other ways you hope to engage with Baltimore City residents? And I'm going to leave the last part of her question because it gets to the next three questions. But so is there anything you can share? I mean, I know I have a lot to share, but with the ways in which Peabody is already connected.
Why don't you take a crack at this question, Sarah? Because I know you got a lot to say about it. So it's
absolutely. So since I've been on staff at Peabody, which is I came the first year after Dean Bronstein arrived, my portfolio has included building community partnerships and then programs out of those partnerships. And we have Peabody, now again, this is a pre-COVID world, but we had Peabody performers playing in every division of the Pratt Library system within the city. We had regular Friday afternoon rush hour performances at Penn Station. We have some really robust embedded programs with senior communities throughout the Baltimore metropolitan area. We have artists in Johns Hopkins Hospital at the bedside of patients and also in lobby contexts, providing music environmentally and atmospherically. We just are in the midst of forming a new partnership with Gilchrist Hospice Center to bring students there. We've had, and as Susan indicated, we have periodically done citywide pop-up blitzes where we go all over the city to bring short, informal, impromptu concerts to folks. We also have a deep partnership with OrgKids. Most of the OrgKids fellows and teaching artists are Peabody students or Peabody graduates. And we work very closely jointly with OrgKids to bring access to music within the Baltimore City school system. We also have a couple of pedagogy initiatives that bring Peabody students to different schools around this, also in the city. The Junior Bach program is, I think, almost 15 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just celebrating its 15th anniversary. And that is a composition project with a number of schools, including the Baltimore Leadership School for Young Women and St. Ignatius School, among others. So there've been a lot of programs, a lot of energy spent on building all of these programs with the appropriate grounding in best practices in community partnership. And there's a lot more to be done, but a lot to show for what our students are doing in the community now. And they all gain really important skills and deepen their artistry. In some cases, transform their artistry through the work that they've been doing. So I'm going to pivot now to the question. I think I addressed this, but I just want you to know, Fred, 3 different listeners asked questions about, are there other ways for Peabody to connect with public schools in providing educational resources to districts that might not have resources to support these programs? Another question, in terms of building audiences, how important is it to establish partnerships with schools starting at the elementary school level, perhaps by providing free teaching performances? So I don't know if you'd like to respond to
Yeah, no,
that
I would like to.
desire to connect.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And I think Peabody, I would like to see us in the years ahead focus more on, frankly, on the public schools, particularly the Baltimore public schools. I think we have a lot of relationships with a lot of schools around the state. We've had a music education program, so we have a lot of, I think probably about a half to 2/3 of the music teachers in the surrounding counties are actually Peabody music ed graduates. And so, certainly we've got a lot of folks in the field, but I think that we've not done as much with the Baltimore City schools, I think, as we can and should. And partly that is, quite frankly, it's very challenging. The programs and the ability to launch programs is challenging and limited, and resources are very limited. But I think, having said that, I think it's really important for us in the years ahead. We have some partner schools that we've worked with, certainly. I'm not saying we've done that, but I would like to see us do more of that and be able to help the Baltimore schools in a more systemic way benefit from what Peabody has to offer. And I think we need to figure out how to do that.
One suggestion, I think, that is just the low-hanging fruit is to really look into developing virtual programming so that scheduling and transportation and all of that, those barriers are removed. And I think we've all learned in this pandemic that we can absolutely engage meaningfully through digital means. Arthur Parks asks 2 excellent questions, and I want to share them both. My grandson has guitar lessons virtually from a teacher in Israel, and recently they did a Zoom recital. Is this a virtual opportunity for Peabody to extend to Black and Brown students nationally?
Look, absolutely. I think that, the whole thing about technology is it gives us an opportunity to just reach more people. Now, there is always the issue of, as we're looking to diversify, of, getting resources to people, right? Do you have access to the technology? That can be a very real issue. So, making sure that happens is an important part of it also. But yes, I think that, look, part of Peabody's whole, and here again, Peabody is really taking a leadership role in our field among music schools in terms of building the diversity of the students that are coming into a place like Peabody, as well as the faculty. And I think it is, if, here's the way I see it, I think if every major music school across our country did this work, in a way that it was really at the core of what you're doing, I think we could change the field, because there would be enough people that we would generate and bring through that we could change the field. But it requires that kind of, I think, concerted effort. So we're really trying to show leadership in this area by doing this. And I would certainly say, look, Tuned In program is a very good example of it. Tuned In, which is our little ones that are studying instruments in Baltimore City, it's an all scholarship program. We've got about 100 students in the program now. All of these kids that have come out of this school have gone on to college. Some of them have actually gone on to music school, including Peabody. And so, and that whole program this fall was online. Actually, it continues to be online now. And so, so this is very possible. And yes, I think it is a way of expanding and reaching more, increasingly diverse populations of students.
And now Arthur's other question. What kind of indoctrination will be required for professional musicians, and then in parentheses, unions, to adapt and embrace reimagining performance venues?
Look, it's a great question. I spent, 18 to 20 years in the orchestra business. So, dealt with unions and had very good relationships with unions, and had from time to time very hard conversations with unions. I think that we need a collective kind of approach across our industry to these issues. I think we have to work, the unions have to work with the administrations have to work with the unions, with an understanding that in order to solve these problems, whether you're talking about access, whether you're talking about the audition process. We had to have a whole conversation about the audition process for orchestras. And does that need to change? I happen to think it does. And that's a very challenging conversation. And so, but I think what we have seen is that, and again, here is where I think COVID can be helpful. There are, as horrible as it's been, there are positive things that will come out of it. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is that it has forced a lot of institutions to rethink what they're doing. And I think it's at least opened the door. Now, whether or not a given institution follows through and really is aggressive about how they approach this, it's going to require that. And it's going to require, working hand in hand with, with our, colleagues in the unions and our musicians and staff and board members. And I mean, anybody who's part of the community of a performing arts institution has to be part of rethinking, what this looks like. But again, I come back to, to me, look, people are really good at adjusting when survival is at stake. It's amazing how survival gets your attention. And I think that, this has raised for a lot of people the question of survival. And so I hope that institutions will take this opportunity to leverage, a willingness to be more adaptable and flexible, but to do the hard work that's going to be required to, to make some of the changes that are needed. And it comes back to that point that we talked about, that came out of the symposium about the need for more flexible and adaptable institutions, and that doesn't mean somebody wins and somebody loses, it just means you have to think differently about how that institution is structured.
And the artists need to be prepared to bring the skills to be successful in non-traditional venues as well.
Absolutely. And I think, look, it is, and I will be very transparent about this. And Sarah and I have this conversation all the time. Peabody is teaching this to our artists, but we still have young students that come in at 18 years old and they are resistant to it. They think their job is to play the violin as well as possible and nothing else matters. And, we are working really hard to teach them, yes, it's critical that you play the violin at the highest level, because you can't, the conversation begins there, but the conversation doesn't end there. It begins there. and you have to surround it with these other kinds of things, and you have to think about these things differently than maybe you might have imagined. And some of our students are really wonderful about that and are used to it and have thought about it, and others maybe less so. And so, our job is to help people to open their eyes to the possibilities.
We have time for one more question. And here is, it's about synergy between Peabody and the School of Medicine. So the question is, given your close connection with the School of Medicine, have you found synergies to connect artists with opportunities to participate in the healing process for patients?
Well, this is another great Sarah question. So, because Sarah is heading up our music and medicine area, so I'm going to let her speak to this, but I will just say that, yes, I think that one of the things that was very striking from the beginning of coming to Hopkins was this, and this is partly why Sarah was actually hired, is this idea that where else could you do the kind of work that is important to do around music and medicine, whether it's the healing use of music or dance to heal as a palliative, treatment, non-invasive treatment, for diseases. And also the flip side of that is how we treat and take care of musicians, in terms of injury prevention. And so, and then there's a whole component of arts in public health. And so I think this is, and where else could you do this? There's not a better place you could do it than a place like Hopkins, which has a world-renowned medical center and hospital and medical school, and also a world-renowned artistic institution like Peabody. And so I think that that's, it's the logical place to do it. And indeed, we are doing it. And maybe Sarah just briefly, say a few things about some of those things. It's a long list, but
It is a very long list. And in the interest of time, I'll just say that we've barely scratched the surface. There's tremendous potential at Peabody and Johns Hopkins Medicine, but also across the field. This is a growing, burgeoning area. And there are real significant roles for musicians in this work. And stay tuned and check out, what's happening, because hopefully we'll have some really exciting, growth to share with you soon. And with that, we've drawn to the end of our time today. I just wanted to thank you, Fred, for such a lively conversation and for sharing your perspectives and your honesty and candor, and to thank all of you who've posed such interesting questions. And just to remind you that if you're interested in more of the conversation that took place on February 10th, please do check out the link in your invitation, or go to the Peabody website and search The Next Normal. All of the panel discussions are there, as well as some other artifacts from the day. And we just thank you for your time and for joining us today.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.